Pack your things, Melissa. We've decided your bedroom would make a perfect home gym for your brother. He needs his space now that he's a college graduate. My mother said it while tossing a roll of black trash bags onto my bed. Not handing them to me. Tossing them. The way you toss a roll of paper towels to someone about to clean up a spill. Her eyes were already scanning my walls, measuring the distance from the window to the closet, calculating where the treadmill would fit. She didn't look at me once. My brother Derek stood in the doorway behind her, one shoulder leaning against a frame like he owned the place. He was holding a flute of champagne, the good kind, the View of Cliquot I had put on the counter that morning as a graduation gift, and his smirk had that particular shape it got when he knew he'd won something. Not earned. Won. Those were always different things with Derek. I looked at him. I looked at my mother. I looked at the black trash bag sitting on the quilt my grandmother had made me, and I felt something happen inside my chest that I can only describe as a door closing very, very quietly. I had been in this house since I was 8 years old. I had slept in this specific room, not the basement they'd moved me to at 15, but this room, originally, since the second week we moved in. I knew which floorboard creaked near the radiator. I knew that the window latch stuck unless you lifted the frame slightly while you turned it. I had painted these walls myself the summer I was 20, a color called antique linen because it was the cheapest option at the hardware store, and I'd wanted something that felt like warmth. For 10 years, I had been the reason those walls were still standing. I had worked 3 jobs simultaneously for most of those 10 years. The overnight shift at the pharmacy, where I was eventually assistant manager. The weekend catering gigs, where I stood in other people's kitchens for 8 hours and carried trays of food I couldn't afford to eat. And the data entry contracts I picked up on my laptop during my breaks, my fingers moving over the keyboard in the break room at 2 a.m., making an extra $400 a month that I immediately transferred into the family account. Not my account. The family account. I had paid the mortgage. I had paid the property taxes. I had paid Derek's tuition installments, his apartment rent near the university, the furniture in that apartment, the emergency credit card that somehow always had Derek's transactions on it when I checked the statement. I had paid for the champagne he was holding while he watched my mother throw trash bags onto my bed. They told people I was just a clerk who lived in the basement. That was the official family story. Melissa? Oh, she's fine. She just sort of exists here, you know. She's not really going anywhere. They thought they were finally getting rid of the family embarrassment. They had no idea that the mortgage company they'd been sending checks to for 10 years wasn't a bank. It was me. And as I stood there watching Derek reach past my mother to pick up one of my framed childhood photos, the one of me at 6 years old, gap-toothed and sunburned at the beach, and drop it into a trash bag without looking at it, I felt the door in my chest finish closing. The lock clicked into place. And a voice in my head, very calm, very clear, said, "Not yet."
Smile. Nod.
Let them think they won. Because in 48 hours, the gym wasn't going to be the only thing moving out. The entire family was about to find out exactly what happens when you try to evict the person who owns the ground you're standing on. But first, I need to tell you how I got there. I need to tell you about the 10 years before that moment, because you cannot understand what I did without understanding what was done to me. And I need to tell you about the night I sat on a basement floor at 4 a.m. with a highlighter and a legal pad and realized that the weapon I needed had been sitting in a filing cabinet the whole time. I was 18 years old when I made my first sacrifice for this family, and I want to be precise about that word. Sacrifice. Because what I did wasn't generosity. Generosity implies you had a choice. What I did was look around at the situation, understand that no one else was going to hold it together, and step into the gap. The way you step into a gap in a dam. The way water goes where it's needed. My father had been laid off in March of that year. My mother had a part-time job at a church office that paid $11 an hour. We had a mortgage, a car payment, groceries for 4 people, and Derek's upcoming enrollment at the community college, which my parents had been describing for years as the beginning of his great future. I sat at the kitchen table with my parents' bills spread out in front of me, the way I had been doing since I was 15 because no one else seemed able to organize paper, and I did the math. I did the math, and then I did it again, hoping I'd made an error. I hadn't. I said, "I'm going to pick up more shifts." My father said, "That's my girl." That was all. That was the entire transaction. That's my girl. Like I'd offer to take out the trash. I picked up more shifts. I picked up the catering on weekends. I started the data entry contracts. I moved money. I kept the lights on. And Derek enrolled in college that fall wearing new sneakers my mother had bought him with money I'd transferred into the account 2 days earlier, carrying a backpack I'd seen on a credit card statement, looking forward to a future that I was quietly constructing beneath his feet without anyone saying my name. But that wasn't the most disgusting part. The most disgusting part was that I loved them. I want you to understand that clearly, because I think people hear a story like this and they assume the protagonist was always cold, always strategic, always separate from the family she was eventually going to dismantle.
That was not me.
I loved my parents in the specific, painful way you love people who are flawed and oblivious and yours. I loved Derek the way you love someone you watched grow up, even when they frustrate you, even when they take you for granted. I used to think that if I just kept loving them, the love would eventually come back in the form of recognition. I was wrong, but I didn't know I was wrong yet. That's important. I need to tell you about the Wednesday mornings because the Wednesday mornings are really where this story lives. Every Wednesday morning for 10 years, I transferred money from my personal account into the family account. Every Wednesday morning, I sat at my kitchen table or the break room table or my car, depending on where I was, and moved money, the way you move a weight you've gotten so used to carrying that your muscles have stopped registering the effort. I tracked every transaction in a spreadsheet. I am, by nature, a person who tracks things. I kept records. I kept every receipt, every bank statement, every transfer confirmation. My mother used to make fun of me for this, in a gentle, affectionate way that I now understand was anything but. Melissa and her spreadsheets, she'd say to relatives at holidays. You know, she keeps a spreadsheet for everything, even the grocery list. And everyone would laugh, and I'd smile, and she'd move on to bragging about Derek's coursework. She never once considered that those spreadsheets were the paper trail of a decade of financial support. She never once thought that my obsessive record-keeping was going to matter.
It mattered.
But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the moment the first crack appeared, the moment I stopped being entirely naive about what this family was and what I was to them. Derek was 23. He was halfway through his 4-year degree, which had taken him 5.5 years so far due to what my parents called finding his direction. I called it changing his major 3 times and failing 2 courses he'd taken twice, but I never said that out loud. I was working all 3 jobs. I had just negotiated my assistant manager raise at the pharmacy and was trying to figure out how to use the extra income to actually build something for myself, for once. I came home from a double shift one evening. This was a Tuesday in late October, the air already cold, the kind of cold that gets into your coat collar, and I was so tired I was operating on that specific autopilot that kicks in after year 5 of not sleeping enough. I came in through the back door the way I always did. I set my bag down. I started to take off my shoes. And I heard my mother on the phone in the kitchen.
She was using the voice she used with Derek.
That particular softness, that particular warmth, like she was talking to something precious and breakable. She was saying, "Don't worry, baby. Once you have the house, you can fix it up however you want. The basement room would make a perfect home office. Your father and I will take the guest house once we convert the garage." I went completely still. I still had one shoe half on. The outdoor cold was still on my face. I stood in the mudroom, and I did not breathe. She said, "Melissa won't be an issue. She's always just existed here, you know? She'll figure something out. She always does." And then she laughed. It was a gentle laugh, a fond, almost, the laugh of a woman talking about a piece of furniture that had served its purpose. Like she was saying, "Oh, the old lamp. We'll just find a spot for it." I put my shoe back on. I went back out the door. I sat in my car in the driveway for 37 minutes. I know it was 37 because I watched the clock on the dashboard the entire time, the numbers turning over while I sat in the cold and tried to locate my feelings. Here is what I found when I looked for them. Not surprise. And that was the worst thing. The reason I sat there for 37 minutes was not shock. It was the dawning recognition that I had always known. Somewhere beneath the love and the hope and the Wednesday morning transfers, that this was what I was to them. A mechanism. A utility. Something that existed here. I went back inside. I made dinner. I set the table for 3. I smiled when my father asked how my shift was and said, "Fine, really good, actually." I ate. I washed my dish. I went downstairs to my basement room. And then I sat at my desk and I started making a list. Now, I want to be honest with you about something. The list I made that night was not a revenge plan. Not yet. It was a self-preservation plan, which is a different thing, even if it ends in the same place. I was making a list of what I had, what I built, what I was owed, and what, if this family truly intended to hand everything to Derek, I needed to do to make sure I didn't end up with nothing. My name was already on several of the family's financial documents. I was an emergency contact, a co-signer in 2 places, and this was the important part, I was the sole named contact for the entity that held the mortgage. Because 4 years earlier, when I was 26, I had done something that I'd thought at the time was an act of love. I had bought the mortgage. Let me explain this carefully, because it's the hinge that everything else swings on. When I was 26, I sat down with a financial advisor named Carol, who worked out of the pharmacy's corporate wellness program and was the first person in my adult life who looked at my financial situation and said, with genuine urgency, "Melissa, you have to start building equity or you'll have nothing in 30 years. She looked at the numbers, the transfers, the 3-job income, the family account, and she set down her pen and she looked at me and she said, "How long have you been doing this?" I said, "Since I was 18. She said, "And what do you have to show for it?" I didn't have an answer. Carol connected me with a real estate attorney named Diane. Diane was practical and precise and had a voice like cold water, and she walked me through a concept called a private mortgage. The idea was straightforward. Instead of my parents paying their predatory bank every month, and it was predatory, the loan they'd signed in 2003 was a nightmare of adjustable rates and fine print. They would pay me. I would form an LLC, use my savings and a small refinancing loan to buy out the remaining balance on their mortgage, and become the actual lien holder on the property. My parents would get a lower monthly payment. I would build equity. The property would still be in their name. It was structurally an act of love. I need you to understand that. I was not setting a trap. I was trying to protect people who were not protecting themselves, and not protecting me either, but I hadn't fully reckoned with that second part yet. I formed the LLC. I called it Meridian Home Solutions because it sounded like nothing, like background noise, like a company no one would ever think to look up. I hired Diane. We structured the private mortgage note. We included a reversion clause. Diane insisted on it. I had barely paid attention to it at the time. That stated, in the event of any attempt to transfer title without written consent from Meridian Home Solutions, the property would immediately revert to the LLC. Then I sat my parents down at the kitchen table, and I explained the whole thing.
Clearly, carefully.
I had a folder. I had printed documents. I walked through every page. My father said, "This is what Melissa does. She handles the paperwork," and turned back to the football game. My mother said, "As long as Derek's future isn't affected." They signed without reading. And I thought, I genuinely, naively, completely believed that I was protecting all of us. I kept paying. Every month, the family account received a transfer from me. Every month, the family account sent a payment to Meridian Home Solutions. Every month, Meridian Home Solutions logged the payment, maintained the lien, continued to hold the property as collateral. For 6 years, this machine ran perfectly, invisibly, like a heartbeat. And then the night came when I heard my mother say, "Melissa, won't be an issue." And I remembered the reversion clause. If I had known in that moment exactly what was coming, I might have acted differently. I might have moved faster or slower or said something right then in the mudroom before I put my shoe back on. But I didn't know yet what I was going to find in the filing cabinet. I didn't know about the title search. I didn't know about the lawyer they'd already hired. I just knew something was wrong and that I needed to understand exactly what before I did anything at all. So I got the filing cabinet. It was a Thursday night when I pulled out the files. Derek was back at his apartment near school. My parents had gone to bed early. I carried the entire cabinet drawer down to my basement room and set it on my floor under the lamp, and I started reading. I mean that literally. I read every document, every mortgage statement from 2003 to the refinance, every tax record, every insurance policy, the original loan documents with their adjustable rate clauses highlighted in the bank's own ink, my refinance agreement with Meridian, every transfer confirmation I had ever printed and filed. I had a yellow legal pad. I had 3 highlighters. I had a cold cup of coffee and the specific, laser-focused clarity that only comes when you are genuinely frightened and genuinely angry at the same time. I found the reversion clause at 4:17 in the morning. I read it 3 times. I photographed it with my phone. I photographed every document I hadn't photographed already. And then, at the back of the drawer, behind a folder of old car insurance cards, I found something I hadn't put there. It was an envelope from a title company. The same title company I had used when I set up Meridian 6 years earlier. My hands went steady in a way that had nothing to do with calm. I opened it. It was a preliminary title search inquiry, filed under my parents' names, dated 11 days earlier. The title company had been asked to search the property for encumbrances in preparation for a deed transfer. They had found the Meridian lien and were requesting clarification. My parents were already trying to transfer the deed to Derek. They had hired a title company. They had begun the legal process. And they had done it, all of it, without saying one word to me. I sat there on my basement floor with that letter in my hands, and I thought about 6 years of mortgage payments. I thought about the Wednesday morning transfers I'd been making for a decade. I thought about the winter I worked every single available shift at the pharmacy to cover a gap in the family budget caused by a car repair no one had mentioned to me until after the money was already gone. I thought about Derek's apartment and his furniture and his sneakers and his champagne. And I thought about the reversion clause. Meridian Home Solutions held a senior lien on this property. Any attempt to transfer the deed without my written consent triggered an immediate reversion of the property to the LLC. They had already filed the transfer paperwork. The reversion had already been triggered. I didn't know that yet. I had to call Diane to confirm it, but I felt it, sitting there on the floor at 4 a.m. with my highlighter in my hand. I felt the whole architecture of the situation rearranging itself, all the pieces clicking into alignment in the dark. The years of sacrifice. The mortgage I'd bought out of love. The clause Diane had insisted on. The title search they'd done without telling me. They hadn't built a trap for me. They'd built it for themselves and handed me the key. My brother made one fatal mistake. He forgot that I was the one who kept the books. I got up off the floor. I stacked the documents. I made a fresh cup of coffee. I sat at my desk and I opened my phone's email app. And I wrote to Diane. But here's where the story gets darker before it gets better, and I need to tell you this part honestly because if I skip it, you won't understand how close I came to losing everything anyway. I thought, after that night on the floor, that I had all the cards. I thought the reversion clause was the end of the story, that I'd call Diane, she'd confirm the trigger, and then I'd have some kind of clean, obvious resolution. I was wrong. For 3 weeks after I found that letter, things got significantly worse before they got better, and the person responsible for making them worse was not my mother. It was my Aunt Linda. I need to tell you about Aunt Linda because I had spent 30 years trusting her, and the specific quality of that trust was the reason what happened hurt as badly as it did. Aunt Linda was my mother's younger sister. She was smart, warm, funny in a dry way that I'd always loved. She was the family member who'd always seemed to actually see me, who'd asked about my work with genuine interest, who'd remembered details from conversation to conversation, who'd said to me once, at a family Thanksgiving when I was maybe 24, "You know, Melissa, you're the most capable person in this family. I hope they know that." I'd thought about that sentence for years. I'd held on to it. What I had not understood, what I would not understand until I was sitting in Diane's office looking at a series of text messages, was that Aunt Linda had been the architect of the plan to give the house to Derek. Not my parents.
Them.
My mother was following a script that Linda had written. It started, according to the text Diane showed me, 3 years earlier. Linda had been talking to my mother about estate planning. This was innocent enough on its surface, and had suggested, with what I can only imagine was extraordinary casualness, that it might be wise to secure Derek's future, by getting the property into his name while my parents were still healthy and able to sign documents. My mother had been receptive. Linda had escalated. Linda had found the lawyer. Linda had suggested the graduation date as the perfect moment, the symbolic gesture, the crown on Derek's achievement. And Linda, this is the part that made me grip the edge of Diane's conference table, had also been the one to suggest that I shouldn't be told. Melissa will make it complicated, the text read, and I could hear Linda's voice in those words with horrible clarity. That dry intelligence turned against me. She's always in the paperwork. Better to make it done before she can find a way to insert herself. Insert myself into the situation involving the mortgage I owned. She'd called it inserting myself. I had been betrayed by the person in my family I had trusted most. And I want to be honest about what that felt like, because this story is not only about legal documents and strategic revenge. This is also about what it does to you when someone you loved uses their knowledge of your character against you. Linda knew I kept records. Linda knew I was always in the paperwork. She used that knowledge to try to cut me out before I could use it. She had taken the thing that was most essentially me and tried to weaponize it against me. I sat in Diane's office and I did not cry. I'd made a decision, sometime between the floor and that conference room, that I was done spending my emotional energy on people who had treated it as a resource to be depleted. I looked at those texts and I felt a door close that I don't think has opened since. Then I looked at Diane and I said, "Okay, walk me through every option we have." Because here's the thing about being the person who kept the books, who filed the documents, who sat on the floor at 4 a.m. and read every line. I had also, without realizing it, kept the books on myself. I had kept every record of every transfer. I had the Meridian structure, fully documented, fully legal. I had 6 years of mortgage payments traceable to my LLC. I had a valid senior lien on the property. I had a triggered reversion clause. And I had something else, something I hadn't thought about until Diane mentioned it. I had a claim, not just on the property, on the contributed funds, on 10 years of documented financial support that had never been acknowledged, never formalized, never repaid. Diane said the word unjust enrichment, and then she explained what it meant, and then she said, "How detailed are your records?" And I opened my laptop and showed her my spreadsheets, and she looked at them for a long time. She said, "Melissa, I want you to know that I've been doing this for 19 years, and this is the most thorough documentation I have ever seen from a non-attorney." I said, "I kept records because I wanted to feel like it was real, like what I was doing mattered, even if no one was watching." She said, "It mattered. It's going to matter enormously." That was the moment the cold settled in fully. Not anger. Anger is hot. Anger wants to break things. This was something different. This was the specific temperature of someone who has finished grieving and started planning. I picked up my pen. I pulled my legal pad across the table. And I said, "Tell me what we're going to do. I want to take you to the graduation party because that's where the second act ends and the third begins." The party was on a Saturday in late May, and the sky was that specific, irritating shade of perfect blue that always appears on days when your life is about to change. The kind of sky that makes bad news feel almost staged. My mother had been cooking for 3 days. There were 40 people in the yard, neighbors, relatives, my father's work colleagues, Derek's friends. A banner across the front of the house that said, "Congratulations, Derek," in gold letters. I had helped hang the banner. I want you to sit with that. I had helped hang a banner on the house I owned. I carried food out. I refilled ice. I hugged relatives I saw once a year. My cousin asked what I was up to, and I said, "Just working, staying busy." And he nodded and moved on. My Aunt Linda arrived in a yellow dress and kissed my cheek and told me I looked wonderful, and I smiled and said, "So do you," and held her gaze for just 1 second longer than necessary. She looked away first. She'd looked away first ever since Diane had shown me those texts. I don't think she knew I knew, but some part of her could feel it. Derek arrived like a headliner taking the stage. New suit, new shoes, Brianna on his arm, radiating the uncomplicated glow of a man who has been told his whole life that he is exceptional and has finally been given an event that confirms it. He worked the yard. He shook hands, accepted hugs, laughed loudly. He didn't say hello to me for 45 minutes. Then he walked past me toward the drinks table and said, without slowing, "Melissa, you're blocking the cooler." "Not thank you."
Not hi. You're in my way.
I stepped aside. At 4 o'clock, my mother tapped a fork against a glass. She gave a speech, real, practiced, the kind that had clearly been written and rewritten. She talked about Derek's journey, his sacrifice, his brilliance.
She cried.
My father put his arm around her. Then my father stepped forward and handed Derek an envelope and said, "We wanted to give you something real. Something that means you'll always have a home." The crowd leaned in. Derek opened the envelope. Inside was a letter from their lawyer confirming that a deed transfer of the family home was in progress, pending clearance of what the letter described as a minor encumbrance currently being resolved. A minor encumbrance. My LLC's senior lien on the entire property described as a minor encumbrance. The crowd oohed. Brianna kissed Derek's cheek. My Aunt Linda pressed her hand to her heart. My father clapped Derek on the shoulder and said, "It's yours. It's always been yours." I was holding a paper plate with a piece of graduation cake. Yellow frosting. I took a bite. I nodded when the woman next to me said, "Wasn't this wonderful?" I looked at my brother holding that letter, at my aunt in her yellow dress, and my mother wiping her eyes, and I thought, 22 days. I had filed my paperwork 22 days ago. Diane had been moving while the party was being planned. The moment I brought her the triggered reversion documents and the evidence of the unauthorized transfer filing, she had moved with the kind of precision that made me understand why she'd been doing this for 19 years. She had submitted formal notification of the reversion to the county recorder's office. She had filed Meridian's ownership assertion. She had sent certified letters, signature required, to my parents, to their lawyer, to the title company, and to Aunt Linda, who had been functionally acting as an agent in the transfer process. By the time my father handed my brother that envelope, the reversion had already been processed. The house was already mine. Not Meridian's in some abstract, corporate sense. Mine. I was the sole member of the LLC. The property had reverted to the LLC. I owned the LLC. In every way that mattered legally. I owned the ground they were all standing on when my father said it was always been yours. The certified letters arrived on Monday morning. I was not home. I had moved out on Friday, quietly over 3 days, while my mother was visiting her sister and my father was at work. I hadn't announced anything. I hadn't made a scene. I had taken my documents, my laptop, my clothes, and the one box of childhood items that still mattered to me, and I had moved them into a short-term furnished apartment 14 minutes away. Clean walls, parking lot view, a coffee maker that worked. It was the most peaceful space I had ever occupied in my adult life. My mother called me 6 minutes after the certified letter was delivered. I watched my phone count down, knowing she'd open it, knowing what would happen when she did. When it rang, I let one more second pass, just one, and then I answered. She said, "Melissa, what is this? What is this paper?" I said, "That's a notice from my company." "Your company? What company?" "Meridian Home Solutions. The LLC that's been receiving the mortgage payments for the last 6 years." The silence on the other end had texture. It had weight. I could feel her processing. The name she'd written on 6 years of checks. The name she'd never once thought to look up. The background noise company. She said, very quietly, "You own the house." "Yes." "You've owned Melissa for how long?" "Since the refinance." 6 years. 6. Her voice broke. And I want to be honest, it hurt to hear. Not enough to stop me, but it hurt. Because she was my mother, and the sound of her voice breaking was something my nervous system had been responding to since I was small. I said, "I need you to know that I'm not trying to put anyone on the street. Diane is going to reach out about your options. There's a fair path through this. But I need you to understand what the situation actually is. And I need you to understand that I know about the title transfer. I know you hired a lawyer. I know this wasn't a sudden decision."
She didn't speak.
"I hope you and Dad are okay," I said. "I'll talk to you soon." I hung up. I sat in my furnished apartment. Outside the window, a car pulled into the parking lot. The engine cut out. Everything was very quiet. I felt, and this is the truest thing I can tell you, I felt like I had put something down that I'd been carrying since I was 15 years old. Not happiness. Not triumph. Just the physical sensation of a weight leaving your hands after you've been holding it so long you'd forgotten your hands could be empty. My father called 3 hours later. He used his warm voice, the one he deployed when he needed something, the voice with the reasonable, unhurried quality of a man who had always gotten what he wanted by simply being patient and confident. He opened with, "I think there's been a misunderstanding."
"There hasn't," I said.
"We didn't know the company was yours. You should have made that clearer." I sat you at the kitchen table and explained the entire structure. You said, "This is what Melissa does, she handles the paperwork," and went back to your football game. I have the signed documents from that meeting. I have the date and the witness. Silence. Then, slowly, "I think we may not have appreciated you the way we should have." There it was. The thing I had waited 22 years to hear. Offered now as a negotiating chip. Wrapped in May and the way we should have. Calibrated to land like an apology without actually being one. I recognized it the way you recognize a song you used to love when it comes on in a place you didn't expect, with a nostalgia that doesn't change what it is. I said, "I appreciate you saying that. Diane will be in touch." Derek called Wednesday. His voice was younger than I'd heard it in years, stripped of the smug gloss, and underneath it was something frightened and, I think, genuinely ashamed. He said, "I didn't know it was your company. I swear." "I know," I said. "So what happens to them? That's between me and Mom and Dad. I'm not trying to hurt you, Derek." "Melissa," he stopped. Then, after a moment, "The trash bags. The home gym thing. That was... I should have said something." I let the silence hold for a beat. "Yeah," I said. "You should have." I want to tell you about the conversation with Aunt Linda because it was the last one and the shortest, and in some ways the one that required the most from me. I called her on a Thursday morning. I had Diane's texts printed in front of me. I didn't use them. I didn't need them. She answered on the second ring and immediately started talking, apologies, explanations, context, the whole architecture of self-justification she'd had 3 days to build since the certified letter arrived at her door. She said she'd just been trying to help. She said she hadn't realized. She said she loved me, which was possibly even true, and somehow that made it worse. I waited for her to finish. Then I said, "Linda, I know you wrote the plan. I know you suggested the lawyer. I know you said I'd insert myself into the process and told them to move before I could find out. I have the texts." The silence that followed was different from my mother's silence or my father's silence. It was the silence of someone who thought they were the smartest person in the room and has just discovered they were wrong. I said, "I'm not going to take any further action regarding your involvement. But I need you to understand something. You used everything you knew about me, my organization, my record-keeping, my tendency to be in the paperwork, to try to cut me out of the thing I built. You took the best parts of who I am, and you used them as arguments for why I should lose." She said my name. I said, "I hope you think about that." And I hung up. The legal resolution took 3 weeks. Diane was thorough and relentless, and worth every penny of every dollar I'd been saving in my own accounts for the last 6 years. The accounts my family didn't know about, the ones I'd been quietly building alongside everything I gave away. My parents were served with formal documentation. Their lawyer, who had apparently been only vaguely aware of the Meridian situation when he drafted the gift letter, withdrew from the matter citing a conflict. In the end, this is what happened. My parents signed a formal lease agreement with Meridian Home Solutions. Fair market rent, below what they'd have paid anywhere in the area for a house that size. A 10-year right of first purchase at appraised value, payable on a structured plan. In plain language, they could stay. They could even buy it back, eventually at a fair price. But the deed was in my LLC's name, the lease was in their names, and every party involved now understood exactly what the situation was and had always been. There was also a separate settlement acknowledging my 10 years of financial contribution. The number was not small. I'm not going to tell you the number, because it's not the point. The point is that it was documented, it was acknowledged, and it was real. For the first time in my adult life, what I had done for this family existed on paper with my name attached to it. Not invisibly. Not as background noise. With my name. Derek got nothing from the property. He didn't contest it. I think, and I mean this without pleasure, that the experience of watching the plan fall apart was its own kind of education for him, not one any parent would choose for their child, but one that was honest in a way his upbringing had not been. He moved in with Brianna. He got a job. He sent me a birthday card that said, "I know I owe you more than a card." I put it on my refrigerator. I look at it sometimes. Aunt Linda and I do not speak. Some doors, once closed, stay that way.
I've made peace with that.
My mother and I have dinner every few weeks now. It's careful and a little awkward and sometimes almost unbearably poignant because in those moments I can see her trying, genuinely trying, to be different, to ask about my life with actual interest, to say my name the way she used to only say Derek's. She doesn't always get it right. But she's trying. My father called me once on a random Tuesday night, not because he needed something, just to talk. We talked for 20 minutes about the garden. It was strange and quiet and more honest than anything we'd said to each other in 15 years. When he said goodbye, he said my name, and there was something in the way he said it, a weight, a recognition, that was not there before. It's not enough to undo everything. Nothing will be. But I've decided to let it be something. That's my choice, and choices, I've learned, are the only thing that ever actually belong to me. I've been thinking about what I want to leave you with because I've been sitting with this story for a long time now, and I know what the satisfying ending is supposed to sound like. It's supposed to be triumph. The villain falls, the wronged woman rises, credits roll. And some of that happened and it was real, and I'm not going to pretend it didn't matter. But what I keep coming back to, what I think is actually the truth of the story, is something quieter than triumph. There is a particular kind of person in every family. Maybe you know them. Maybe you are one. They're the person who shows up early and leaves late. The person who knows where everything is, who keeps the receipts, who fills the gaps quietly so the whole structure doesn't collapse. They don't announce themselves. They don't perform. They just work, steadily, in the background, the way a foundation works, invisible until the day you need it. For years, I thought my invisibility was a failure. I thought that if I was truly valuable, people would see me. I thought that love, done right, would eventually be returned. I was wrong about all of that, and learning I was wrong cost me a decade of my life, and I am still, on some level, grieving that. But here is what I've also learned. The people who underestimate the quiet ones always make the same mistake. They see the silence, and they think it's emptiness. They see the patience, and they think it's passivity. They see someone who never fights back, and they assume it's because she can't. They forget that some of us are quiet because we're listening. They forget that some of us keep the books. They forget that a person who has been patient for 10 years is not someone who doesn't know how to act. She's someone who has been waiting for exactly the right moment. My mother thought she was evicting a tenant. She was evicting the landlord. And the reason she didn't know the difference is that she had spent so many years looking past me, looking at Derek, looking at the future she'd planned for him, that she never stopped to ask what I was building in the space she'd left me. Never underestimate the woman you sent to the basement. She's had more time down there to think than you know. I want to ask you something before I go, and I want you to think about it before you scroll away. Have you ever been the person in your family, your workplace, your life, who held it all together while someone else took the credit? Have you ever done the work, the real work, the unglamorous, undocumented, unacknowledged work, and then watched someone else receive the recognition like it was always theirs? And if you have, what are you building in the silence? Because I promise you, the quiet ones always have a plan. We just don't announce it until it's ready. I'm Melissa, and this was The Silent Landlord. Leave me a comment. Tell me your story. I read every single one.